Slavery, lifeblood of historical globalization. So an introduction to slavery and what this video will cover, where and when it was first implemented, the various forms of slavery, responses to slavery and the abolition movement to stop it, people who influenced slavery today and its effects on society, and the connection between both historical and contemporary globalization.
The roots of slavery. Slavery, an overview. Slavery has been around for quite a long time. As long as there has been civilization, there has been slavery. In the early ages of human life, hunter, gatherers, and primitive farmers had no use for slavery. Food was too scarce for it to make sense. It was only when there was a development of more civilized societies that slavery was feasible. Captured prisoners from war were put to work, or poor farmers paid off their debt with labor. There were many different forms of slavery that took place among different civilizations, but all of them had one thing in common: cheap labor. Slavery and its connections to globalization. With the increasing interconnectedness, exploration, and trade that the world was experiencing at the time, imperial powers needed a source of cheap labor. The slave trade became increasingly prominent, causing the slaves to be more and more valuable as time wore on. By using slavery, imperial powers were able to cut down their costs and increase profits. With the cheaper creation of goods, they were then able to make more faster. This increased the growth of the economy significantly, contributing to the wealth to the general population.
Where it began, Portugal, 1400s. The Portuguese traders arrived in West Africa, and African slaves became a valued product that they traded. West African leaders allowed this practice and even helped round them up. Most of these slaves were then sold in Europe as servants. Spain, early 1600s. Spain needed a cheap, large labor force to work on the plantations that were being established. The other European powers such as Holland, France, and Britain started to colonize the Caribbean and set up their own plantations. They need a labor force as well. Later on, the United States also became involved in the slave trade. Impact of slavery and why African slaves were valued. A French historian estimated that between 11 and 15 million were forced to migrate when the slave trade was at its height. Slavery continued in some parts of the world well into the 20th century. Since many of the slaves that were taken were men, there was a significant change in the demographic of the various African kingdoms. This resulted in the dominating economies to collapse, leaving them open to colonization and conquest.
African slaves. Why they were ideal plantation workers. Africans were often skilled in agriculture. They were also ideal workers since they were used to working in tropical conditions and were immune to the diseases that often killed other workers.
The different forms of slavery. There are various forms of slavery, including chattel slavery, indentured slavery, and child labor. Chattel means a personal possession. So in chattel slavery, slaves and their descendants were the private property of their owners. They had no legal standing as human beings. Indigenous peoples and captured Africans were enslaved specifically because of their racial origins.
Indentured slavery. Indenture, a formal legal agreement or contract. An employee bound by contract for a fixed period of time. This was also a way for people to pay their debts if they had no other way. The indenture usually covered a period of 4 to 7 years. People who were well educated might have become high-ranking civil servants or tutors to the children of aristocrats. 2/3 of all European immigrants to what is now known as the United States of America first arrived as indentured workers.
Child labor. Children of the poor had always been put to work as soon as they could to help the family. Every family needed as much money as they could get, even if that meant putting their children to work. Children were preferable workers because they could work for long hours and low wages. Children are also quite small, so this means they could fit in small places. For example, sweeping chimneys or dragging carts through mines.
Responses to slavery and the abolition movement. Slaves weren't allowed to learn, to read, to write, or to leave their plantations unsupervised. They worked in harsh and brutal conditions and had little control over their lives.
The abolitionist movement. Few people knew about what happened inside the plantations. By the late 1700s, there gradually started to be more publication about the cruel treatment that the slaves had to endure. The abolition movement grew as more Europeans started to realize what was occurring at these plantations and began to oppose the practice. Prominent figures in the history of slavery.
William Wilberforce, 1780. He was elected into the House of Commons. 1784. William converted to Methodism, a religious movement that encouraged social reform, including opposition to slavery. This is when he started his lifelong campaign to end slavery. 1807. Successfully persuaded Parliament to pass a law banning the trade in slaves, but his ultimate goal was to ban slavery completely. 1833. The Emancipation Act was passed by Parliament, which abolished slavery in Britain and the British Empire. This happened 3 days before he died. 1834. The law came into force. His critics often accused him of being a fanatic, and he responded, "But to be feeling alive to the sufferings of my fellow creatures is to be a fanatic. I am one of the most incurable fanatics ever permitted to be at large."
Olaya Equiano. At 11 years old, he was kidnapped while in Nigeria by slave traders. He was then bought by a British naval captain and renamed Gustavus Vassa. While on the ship, he worked as a gunpowder carrier during the 7 Years' War, which was the battle between Britain and France, 1756 to 1763. He also learned to read and write, and by the year 1766, he was able to buy his freedom. One of his greatest achievements was when he wrote his autobiography, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaya Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African. In 1789, about 100 books were published on slavery that year, but Equiano's was the only one written by a former slave. In the book, he described the day he bought his freedom. "All within my breast was tumult, wildness, and delirium. My feet scarcely touched the ground, for they were winged with joy. Everyone I met, I told of my happiness. I, who had been a slave in the morning, trembling at the will of another, now became my own master and completely free."
Contemporary globalization. How slavery still affects the world today. Contemporary globalization. Although human trafficking violates international and national laws, it is an increasingly thriving criminal industry. Modern slavery exists when a person's freedoms and rights are taken away from them. This can mean the right to leave the job, workplace, and have the control over their own body. Over 28 million people are trapped in modern slavery. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery where perpetrators use force to manipulate a vulnerable individual. The aftermath of slavery. Both modern slavery and the aftermath of historical slavery influence different societies every day. There is still prejudice against the descendants of the slaves.